this presentation was kind of with the definition. It's unbelievable. Yeah, I already see my presentation. So the terms and approaches, post-colonialism, decolonization, and also critical heritage approaches. So a broad academic discussion on applying post-colonial approaches to the study of post-Soviet countries has begun in the earlier 20s, and this discussion started with the critique of narrow approaches of post-colonial and post-Soviet studies, and ended up with the suggestions to universalize the post-colonial condition, adding to post-colonial map of the first and the third world the Soviet version of the Soviets. So the next slide, please.
But if they don't see it on Zoom, just in a minute.
Okay. And this is effects in the position of David J.D. Moore, the American anthropologist, who is his famous essays, which appear in a second on the screen. He effectively submitted the notion of post-Soviet into the post-colonial. So in Ukraine, the post-colonial theory is becoming an increasingly popular way of explaining current development. In Ukrainian political and public discourses, it shifted the discussion away from critical debate over economic transition and democratization towards quite narrow cultural debates over the subaltern and oppression. The Ukrainian academia consider post-coloniality as a condition characterized by the struggle for autonomy by people enduring a history of dependence. Such heroic reading of post-colonial theory has been very much taken to heart by Ukrainian society, but it leaves out of account the other side of post-colonial.
Which picture do you want?
Yeah, this is the file, and what's happened with the presentation? Is it okay? Because it's
has it changed? It looks different font.
But is it possible to read text or not?
Yes. Yeah.
This? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Could you please come back? I'm sorry for this. I never had such. So let's start with hybridity.
Which one do you want?
The next one, please. The next one, please. Thank you. Thank you. So I start with this heroic reading of post-colonial theory. It's a theory which are focusing on a tragical side of Soviet history. So it's very common for Ukrainian society, but it leaves out of account the other side of post-colonial conditions, the hybridity of post-colonial Ukraine. So the hybridity and ambivalence of the Ukrainian post-colonial experience lies in the fact that on the one hand, it was influenced by Ukrainian status as a core of Tsarist and Soviet imperial projects, and on the other hand, as a center of anti-Tsarist and anti-Russian, anti-Soviet resistance. So if you are talking about the Soviet heritage, Ukraine shared in the cultural project of Soviet imperialism, even while at the same time suffered from it. As such, thus in Ukrainian case, a more profound reading of post-colonial condition is required. with the focus on complex cultural interchanges between master and servant, imperial power and subaltern. The critical rethinking of the Soviet heritage is an opportunity for Ukraine to decolonize itself by taking responsibility for its recent past and making it impossible to manipulate with dissonant, unpleasant heritage. At the same time, the colonial frame made it possible to comprehend and to appropriate the Soviet past as Ukrainian Soviet heritage and to protect Ukrainian society from extension and conflicts on the basis of the future. The next slide, please. So one more terms which should be specified here is heritage. So what does it mean heritage for me and what category I consider it? Here I will quote two quite known research in this field, and you can see on this definition that heritage is defined as a practice and as a process with a strong relation to identity and memory. Trying to explain to my students and trying to simplify the term heritage, I say them that heritage is not about the past, it's not about objects, heritage is about today, it's about us, and it's about how we identify ourselves. But the heritage is a process of critically thinking our past and influence very much our future.
Which image?
This one, isn't it? This one. So I think it's also very important to quote here because the focus of intangible values of built heritage, introducing critical heritage studies in the last decades requires architects to have knowledge of both the physical quality of the objects and the social values embodied by them. This is especially important if we consider post-colonial heritage, such as Soviet heritage in Ukraine is. So the next slide, please. A comprehensive approach to heritage is crucially important for post-traumatic community. Heritage can be both a tool for reconciliation in post-war traumatized community, or its instrument of setting up and deepening the pre-war conflict and tensions. Heritage sites become part of political and social processes shaping post-conflict communities. The post-war policy can contribute to positive changes, enhancing the shaping your identity that are open to diversity and various memories of shared past, or it can indicate negative changes, pushing the society back to the narrow, exclusive of nationalistic interpretation of the past. So Ukraine will inevitably face such a dilemma when the war is over. Next slide, please. For the time being, the Ukraine is following the same track as the most post-communist countries in approaching its heritage, especially Soviet heritage. In Ukraine, as in most post-communist countries, the whole Soviet era is considered as dissonant and undesirable heritage. In the same time, the Soviet culture has been subject to a very controversial interpretations since the independence. The discussion on it turns on emotional perception that resulted in a polarization of society for those. I'm sorry. It's those who believe that everything Soviet must be destroyed. It's mostly Ukrainian academia, And those who, it's mostly activists and young researcher out of academia, who believe that every single Soviet object should be preserved. So thus in such a situation, Soviet buildings have no chance to be incorporated in contemporary life with a new interpretation and new values. They are to be or destroyed or conservated. Within such an approach, Soviet heritage is rather a trigger of tension and conflicts on contested memory in the society. And here I put actually the picture from Lviv Veterinary Academy. And you see here the Soviet mosaics, very well preserved. And actually this picture is very representative to this situation I described to you. So the administration of academy decided to sweep up the mosaic because it's Soviet. Because it's Soviet, and Soviet, it means bad. And actually, it was the activists who said it. So they called all over the world that it's wrong and it can't be done. So, and actually, this picture is really present this tension and really polarization of the attitude to Soviet heritage. Since the beginning of the full-scale war, the issue of Soviet monuments and built heritage has become more urgent. Oh, I really pressed better without this. Sorry. So Russians claims the Soviet Union successor state and Putin dreams to return back to the USSR format by keeping Ukraine within its sphere of influence, triggered in Ukrainian society total rejection of everything what is Soviet and a desire to discard it. The rapid demolition of Soviet monuments after February 24 gains mostly total support of the society. The war united Ukrainian society in supporting official discourse of a traumatic interpretation of the Soviet past. The narratives of victims and heroic resistance to the Soviet totalitarian regime is dominated now. This complex situation assigns to experts, to architects, to historians of architects, an important role of mediator and promoter of a critical discussion in society about its recent past. They should apply to professional ethics and responsibility, and putting aside other their emotions and asking uncomfortable questions. Please, next slide. Is heritage restricted only to something we can be proud of? Can we change or erase our uncomfortable past, just destroying its memorials and buildings? Can only the art component be an argument for preserving of Soviet-built heritage? And finally, the most important is a question: is Soviet past our Ukrainian heritage? So using the case of Kharkiv, I would like to analyze the current discussion on the Soviet heritage and outline all the controversy and challenges the Ukrainian researchers, intellectuals, and experts face in approaching it. So please, next slide. Yeah, so the war uncovered different layers of different layers in the destroyed buildings, revealing richness and complexity of the heritage of the 20th century in Kharkiv. These are the imperial heritage, imperial Russian heritage, as Kharkiv used to belong to Russian Empire. The earlier Soviet heritage, which refers to the city's modernization, intellectual development, and actually the Ukrainian modernity, and the Stalinist one, associated with repressions, terrors, and controls. So the ruin uncovered really 3 layers already not so very comfortable imperial heritage, appealing earlier modern heritage, and undesirable Stalinist heritage. So how to deal with such a complex heritage and what challenges we are facing? So the next slide, please. On this slide, you can see, and maybe you can recognize this building of Kharkiv Region Administration in Svoboda Avenue, and it's one of the edifices dominating the square. The building was seriously damaged in the first months of the war. Now the building can't be used, but it keeps its monumental facade, which refer us to Stalinist architecture. And this building has actually, the next slide, please. And this building has actually the same history and other buildings in Kharkiv. There are a few layers in this building. So in the 19th century, it was built as a residence for provincial governments. Then in the 20s, it was rebuilt in one of the best example of constructivist building for also as headquarters of Central Committee of the Communist Party of Ukraine in Kharkiv. Kharkiv was the capital of the Soviet Ukraine. And during the Second World War, it was damaged very much. And actually, after the war, the new building was erected on its ruin. And actually, this building became one of the brightest examples of Stalinist architecture and very dominant in the square. 1 week after the building was damaged, the head of the Kharkiv regional administration declared that it could be reconstructed and it should be demolished. And this news caused resentment in the professional communities and triggered a discussion that made the officials take his word back. The professional community expressed the solidarity in this issue. So this is for sure, this is the heritage and it should be preserved. But what is the focus of the discussion? And do the discutants refer not only to the form and structure, but also to the intangible meanings and sense? Could you please next slide? And in the next slide, I put some quotes from this discussion, which were in media, in social media, and in academia. So, and in this quote, you can see that all the discussion belongs to discourse of style. So some of experts say that all styles have rights to exist. Others try to Ukrainize the Stalinist architecture, and by doing this, justify its existence and preservation. So what does it mean? What it say? The discourse of style focuses on the physical structure, and it does not develop value-based discussion on built heritage. Such an exclusive focus on the materials values is especially hazardous and dangerous when we are talking about undesirable and conflicted heritage. The discourse of style arises important value-related question, which led us to answer that our heritage is not only about the good and nice Stalinist architecture, but also to totalitarian regime of Stalinism, which was centrally controlled, but it was implemented by people on the local level. And the Soviet Ukraine is the co-creator of the Soviet modernist projects, and the same Ukraine is victims and beneficiaries of that past. The next one, please. So the most challenging in the heritage of the 20s, this appealing earlier modern constructivism architecture. The period of 20s and earlier 30s is now very popular topic for research in Ukraine, and it deals with the history of shaping Ukrainian modern identity based on abandoning the traditional literature, art, and architecture. Kharkiv, as a first capital of Soviet Ukraine, was the center of avant-garde movement and modernistic architecture. And the symbol of the modern Kharkiv, of the modern city of Kharkiv, is the building of, impressive building of Derspro, which every architect know. So this is the mark of modernity of the city, and this is the iconic example of modernistic architecture in the interwar Soviet period. So the modernistic architecture of the 20s put Ukraine in the global context of modernism, and the involvement of the Soviet artists and architects in the global modernistic movement, encouraged by their belief in Bolshevik ideas of progress, equality, and social justice, gave us the greatest architectural heritage of the 20s and 30s. And the modernist architecture of 20s is actually the mix of ideas, approaches, technologies, and ideology, and Bolshevik ideology. Is it, could you please the next slide? So is it just Ukrainian heritage, or is it Soviet heritage, or maybe Soviet Ukrainian or global heritage? Ukrainian society and academia have difficulties dealing with this complex issue. The common tendency in the research of 20s in Ukraine is to separate Soviet and Ukrainians. Soviet is something bad we should get rid of, and Ukrainian it's something good and valuable. In numerous research on the modernistic 20s, one rarely can find the word Soviet or communist. And even when these words are mentioned, it happened to symbolize only the period without treating architects, artists, and poets as important people and their work, important elements of Soviet modernization of Ukraine. It is never mentioned that these intellectuals had left-wing Bolshevik views. This Ukrainian modern literature, art, and architecture of 20s are cut out of the Soviet context. So we're talking about it like just about Ukrainian modern literature, Ukrainian modernistic architecture, Ukrainian art without any context and background of this artist. The Bolshevik and the Soviet context suddenly appeared in the mid-30s when Stalin found constructivism threatening to the regime and oppressed it. The next slide, please. Yeah, so, and today's discussion about preserving modern buildings it's referred to style, which allow to avoid uncomfortable questions about the ideological background of the movement and political views of architects. It also locates the modernistic movements in a narrow ethnic frame, using the terms Ukrainian constructivism, and using the argument that this modernistic architecture was built in Ukraine by Ukrainian architects. So this referred to the ethnic Ukrainian origin of the architects, which actually contradict the modernistic concept, because for modernists, their national identity was not imported. It was on the second Osset stage, but not on the first. They were modernist and they create modern culture. They create modernistic architecture. It was not national, it was international. So in one more quotes, I just put these quotes from academic, the next one, please. Yeah. So when you just see that that researcher tried to just to cut out, yeah, or emphasize this Ukrainian things and trying not to link this Ukrainian modern movement with the global modernistic movement of that time, and also that this movement was based on Bolshevik ideas. So this ethnic or national approach to global cultural movement eliminates the possibility of profound research of modernist architecture and art in Kharkiv and in Ukraine generally. There is no way to rethink and to appropriate Soviet heritage as our heritage, as our Soviet Ukrainian heritage. Moreover, this is a dangerous attempt by Ukrainian researchers and activists now, when buildings are ruined, just to select from these multi-layers ruined buildings, with multi-layers heritage, just to select this very Ukrainian elements and to preserve these elements referring to this notion of our Ukrainian constructivism. So, and the last one, actually, this is only the phrase which I like very much, that we can destroy heritage twice, in the conflict and after the conflict. So to summarize, I would like to emphasize that the perception of the Soviet heritage in Ukrainian society, with its focus on victimization and kind of heroic resistance to Soviet regime reinforced by the war, suggested that Ukraine is still post-colonial and still post-Soviet country, that it's not ready to reflect on its colonial past. Classical approach to heritage as an architectural monuments and buildings with the focus on the physical analysis of the internal built forms, age, scientific, historical, and aesthetic qualities of the object is quite dangerous now. The war revealed various layers of heritage in Ukraine, uncovered continuity, disruptions, and changes in the built heritage, as well as its intangible aspects, such as special quality, the spirit of space, and social and cultural context. And the understanding of the importance of the intangible values of tangible heritage is crucial for avoid tension and conflicts with the local communities after the war, and fostering reconciliation with the past and actually its appropriation as part of our Ukrainian heritage. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and our apologies for the technique problems that we had in the beginning. This was also a very difficult topic. It's difficult in peacetime, and it's much more difficult and difficultly approachable in times of war. So I think this topic will be, we will pull it through the rest of the seminar and also have a talk about it in the end in the panel discussion, because this sort of
yeah. So it's really very hard to talk about it during the war, when the Russia tried to destroy Ukraine and tried to appropriate all this heritage. But I believe that it's very important, because it could be the instrument for manipulation and stirring up the inner conflict after the war. And even if now we are very the society is have a great solidarity, but after the war, the period of tension, it's the first stage which comes after the war. So, and we should work on the topics which already know that it could be a trigger, how to prevent it, how to solve it, and and how to appropriate it as our, because this is actually the way to avoid this tension and conflicts.
That's a good place to take a breath and go on to the next point, but we will come back to these questions. So thank you very much again.